It's Halloween time. The time for leprechauns, banshees, pixies, and hobgoblins to hold their annual powwow.
Hi, and welcome to Debunk File. My name is Sep, and at long last, it is Halloween, the greatest time of the year. You've enjoyed our dives to the depths of the strange and undiscovered horrible killers this Debunktober, but it's time to cap it off with the scariest of all horror, the jump scare. For Halloween, we wanted to do something special. This video is going to document the history of the jump scare, from movies to games to everything. This won't be a comprehensive list of every jump scare ever on screen, but we want to dissect and discuss the most influential scares in cinema, and of course, the scariest. With all that out of the way though, I think it's time to just begin. So, grab all of your Halloween candy and get ready. First, we must discuss what a jump scare is. I'm assuming many of you already know, but we are going to be as technical as possible when describing it. A jump scare is defined as a surprise scare that comes out of nowhere, and normally functions as the climax of very intense scenes in media. Of course, over the years, the jump scare has been overused and has even lost its original intent. As we stated, their original purpose was to finish an intense scene in the scariest possible way. But nowadays, more often than not, they will just be used for cheap and oftentimes false scares. The overuse of the jump scare has led us all to expect them, and when that happens, the fear factor is gone. But today we're just going to be looking at the very best. We'll see how the jump scare began, how it evolved over time, and of course, break down the best that has ever been put on screen. What was the first jump scare? A quick Google search will reveal the first jump scare hailed from the 1940s horror film Cat People. This jump scare is extremely important, but we can't start with this, as the jump scare actually goes much further than that. Keep Cat People in mind, as it will come back very soon, but it's time to talk about the first jump scare ever. The first horror film ever made was titled The Haunted Castle and was released all the way back in 1896. This film is not only the first horror film ever, but holds the very first jump scare in film history. This film seems to follow a haunted house where we see things appear out of nowhere, and at one point, a skeleton appears out of nowhere behind the main character, greatly startling him in the process. There's no sound, of course, but the skeleton truly does appear out of nowhere. And with this being the first horror film ever, this would set the precedent for every jump scare to ever come. It's a very interesting footnote in cinema history, and something not many people are aware of. Even we weren't aware of it before we began researching for this video. With a prototype being from 1896, it's time to ponder what the actual first true jump scare was. After many hours spent searching every website trying to find what it may be, Jif and I settled on the classic 1925 film The Phantom of the Opera as having the first real jump scare. The scene is built up and extremely tense, even for today's standards. As the woman creeps up on her mask captor, hoping to see his face, she peels back his mask for the music to intensify and the Phantom to jerk back and reveal his hideous visage. This scene was built up way before the film was even released, as in promotional footage and pictures advertising the film, Lon Chaney's ghastly Phantom makeup was nowhere to be seen, and in the film, it was greatly built up as well. This was the first time the audience laid eyes upon this monster of a man, and it is truly terrifying even today. This would set us on our path of the modern jump scare, and is extremely overlooked by the rest of the film. Granted, this is by far the most famous scene, but it's not considered by many as a true jump scare. But alas, the pieces are all there. Tense atmosphere, unsettling music, and boom, the surprise and shock. I can only imagine how terrifying this scene would have been all the way back in 1925. A true modern jump scare, which will lead us into our next landmark in the history of the jump scare. Finally, Cat People. The film most people associate as having the first ever jump scare, and there is precedent as to why people perceive it as such. The jump scare in this film was the very first sound jump scare. The atmosphere in the scene is thick. It follows a woman running away from something or someone. She is paranoid and looking behind her while speed walking, with the only sound being her footsteps. When she finally gets to catch her breath and the movie goes quiet out of nowhere, a bus comes out from the corner of the screen and loudly screeches to a halt. This could even be considered the first false jump scare, as it's not something remotely scary at all, made more scary by loud noises and context. It's another historical landmark on our journey. I'd say Phantom and Cat People definitely defined it, and when put together, there's a perfect jump scare there. With the more historical ones out of the way, I want to move up in the timeline and analyze a few jump scares over the decades and watch how each evolves and influences the next. After Cat People, jump scares weren't as common as they are today, but the next one comes from the 1950s classic, The Thing from Another World. The scene begins with a man lying down on the floor after being attacked by the titular Thing from Another World. The men slowly move towards the door the injured man was pointing to. When they open the door, boom, there it is. It's a very slow burn and unexpected jump scare. At the time, it would have been expected that the Thing wouldn't be there and would have been a fake out. But no, the Thing is there in all its growling glory, scares the living crap out of the crew members. The music is loud and brash, and so is the Thing. The movie was the precedent for The Thing from 1982, and the original had some very slow burn and terrifying scenes, including this jump scare. Moving forward into the 60s, horror is truly becoming a different genre, and Psycho is the most famous of the 60s horror flicks. The Alfred Hitchcock classic. Hitchcock directed a multitude of freaky 60s movies for sure, but nothing stands out and has stood the test of time more than Psycho. Of course, we aren't talking about it for no reason. It too includes a few jump scares to boot. Let's take a look at them. I want to address probably one of the most famous scenes of all time, the shower scene. It's one of the greatest, scariest, and most influential scenes in all of horror, but it sure does get all the love. I want to analyze some of the more underappreciated scenes that just happen to be jump scares. The first one is the mother scene. It follows our now main character slowly walking down the steps to a basement hiding from Norman Bates himself, and as she approaches, she sees his mother sitting in the dark basement. When she tries to get her attention, it's revealed that the woman was all but a rotting corpse. It zooms in on her decaying, terrified face, and the iconic music blares while the woman screams in horror, and Norman suddenly appears wearing his mother's clothes, all while holding a knife. This is another very slow burn jump scare with amazing effects and an equally fantastic payoff, as not only is it incredibly effective, but it also completely throws the narratives on its head, and of course, there's that music. It's still so bone-chilling to this day. As I watched it to write this video, I still got chills. Just classic. The next jump scare from Psycho is quite similar, but the payoff is a lot more sinister. It follows a man walking into a house and slowly up the stairs until the mother runs out of the room and suddenly stabs him in the head, and he takes a tumble down the stairs. We knew it was coming, but man is it scary. And again, the music just makes this scene so hard to watch all these years later. Truly, both of these classic jump scares can compete against nearly any modern one. The 60s includes another very interesting and albeit extremely creepy jump scare. It hails from the film Repulsion from 1965. The scene follows a woman walking into her room very slowly, but also very nonchalantly, unexpecting of what's to come. She opens the closet, and when she closes it, the mirror on the closet door reveals a man standing in the same room as her. It's a fast and super out-of-nowhere scare. It really reminds me of most modern out-of-nowhere scares like the lipstick demon from Insidious, which of course, we will get to. The scene is tense, but you don't know why until the scare hits, and it completely shocks the viewer. This one in particular has aged exceptionally well, and I can truly only imagine what this was like in 1965 seeing it for the first time in theaters. Moving on to my personal favorite decade for jump scares, we have the 1970s. Here we're going to analyze a few from this era, starting with 1975's Jaws. The scene in question starts with some men going underwater to examine a sunken ship. Tensions are already high, as the notorious shark could be anywhere, lurking or stalking. The diver carefully and slowly examines the boat when he gets to a compartment, where he opens it only to see a severed head missing an eye pop out with some insanely intense music. This is a genuinely effective jump scare, as I still vividly remember this one making me leap out of my seat the first time I ever saw it happen. But of course, Jaws does have one other scene that is most definitely a jump scare, and while I don't believe it is as technically effective as the aforementioned one, it is essentially the most famous scene in the whole movie, and that is of course the scene where Bruce finally appears for the whole crew to see. This movie is part of what makes Jaws so genius, and that's because Bruce literally appears out of nowhere each time. They can be on the hunt for him and he's a complete no-show, but then they can be in the middle of a conversation and he jolts out of the water, like the scene here, and it is incredibly startling each time. Moving on to our next jump scare of the 70s, and we have what might be the single best jump scare in history. I am, of course, talking about the ultra-famous chest-bursting scene in Alien from 1979. This is likely a scene that you have all seen already, but still, let's go through it. It begins with the entire crew eating while aboard the ship. Everything is normal, until one of them begins getting sick. He's throwing up, and while that's not alright at the end of the day, they aren't thinking that much of it. That is, until he begins screaming in agony. At the point, the audience is most certainly getting suspicious, but what happens next could not have possibly been predicted by anyone. As he is laying on the table, all of a sudden, blood jolts from his chest. It isn't particularly loud, but it is horrifying. It comes out of nowhere and puts so many questions in your head. But then, the true scare happens. Again, out of nowhere, a baby alien bursts out of his chest. There is not a single thing the crew can do but watch this thing as it ominously stares back, until it scampers away. This is a hard scene to judge because it is so famous, but seriously, put yourself in the perspective of somebody in 1979 seeing this film for the first time in theaters. This is absolutely horrifying, and is not just one of the best jump scares of all time, it is also one of the best scenes ever in a horror movie. The 1980s is known as the era of the slashers, and it's fitting that the first jump scare we are going to mention from this era belongs to arguably the most famous slasher film of all time, Friday the 13th. In this film, Jason is mentioned for the entire film, but you never see him at all. Instead, the intention is actually all on his mother, who is the actual antagonist of the movie. For the jump scare, the reason why it's so effective is because of what occurred before it. The character in the boat right here just got finished dealing with the horrifying mother who nearly killed her multiple times. It was an exhausting escape, and here she is, laying in a boat, finally getting some rest. It's a happy ending. I mean, just listen to the music. But then, Jason, who was mentioned all throughout the film but was never seen, leaps out of the lake and takes the titular character with him. This scene literally breaks all the rules. The movie was over. We had our happy ending. For that to happen is so unexpected. I still can't believe it to this day. That is why it is easily one of the greatest jump scares of all time. We mentioned it before, but now it is time again to talk about The Thing, which is also no stranger to the art of the jump scare. As you all know, the basic summary of the film is the fact that the alien in question can shapeshift, meaning nobody can be trusted, and nobody is safe. Luckily for our crew, they were able to find out that the thing's blood reacted in a strange way when touched with a hot substance. As a result, they all draw blood and do this experiment. As the scene goes on, there's no music at all, and there's barely even any sound. We see the intense, untrusting, angry facial expressions of the crew, as they are all at odds with one another. Towards the end of the scene, ironically, when some talking actually begins, he takes some blood without truly focusing on it, and boy, does it react. It shoots up into the air, creating a shrieking noise, and it's all downhill from there, as the thing fully manifests and begins attacking. This is a very unique jump scare that somehow combines intense build-up with being out of nowhere. These two terms sound like they shouldn't be able to coincide, but they somehow do, and it makes for one of the most terrifying jump scares in history. The 90s was an era that, during my research, I actually found to be slightly underwhelming, especially compared to the 2 decades that came before it, and the ones that followed it. But there is one movie that has an incredible jump scare, and it actually hails from one of the most unexpected movies ever, and that is The Exorcist. No, not that Exorcist. I'm actually talking about The Exorcist 3. This jump scare is so good, I've seen it top multiple lists for being the single best jump scare ever put to film. Well, enough talk about it, let's actually analyze it. This is a long scene that basically depicts a hospital in operation. It's a very quiet scene, as it just involves a nurse and various other people walking around while the camera remains stationary. After basically an entire minute of seeing essentially nothing, absolutely out of nowhere, a patient comes out with a knife and murders the nurse, with some extremely loud, bombastic music playing. This is one of the purest examples of ending a scene in the worst possible way, which is what makes it so effective as a jump scare. It doesn't just relieve tension in a dumb way, something genuinely horrifying also happened. And now, the modern age of the jump scare will begin, and that of course starts with the 2000s. The scene in question here is the infamous "I saw her face" scene in The Ring. In this scene, we have two people talking about the ring curse. They begin talking about the girl when all of a sudden it cuts to her gruesome, twisted face with equally disturbing music to boot. This is one of those scenes that doesn't even feature a second of build-up, and I actually still vividly remember this one scaring me many years ago. But now for the era I wanted to talk about the most out of any in this entire video. The 2010s are freshly over, but man was it a ride, and it was very interesting in many ways too. The 2010s allowed for the widespread creation of media in every form, with film of course included. This allowed for more great scenes in horror than ever before, but also of course allowed for more bad scenes than ever seen before. This is the decade where jump scares unfortunately became a cliche, and lost a lot of the punch that they had before. With that being said though, let's just get into the jump scares of this decade though, because as we said, the 2010s truly had some special jump scares regardless of the oversaturation. Let's start with the ultra famous Lipstick Demon. This has quickly become the most iconic jump scare of the 2010s, and it absolutely deserves every bit of attention it gets. A true out-of-nowhere scare once again. This scene revolves around a lady discussing some paranormal activity regarding this family's son. She is talking about seeing an entity point at the kid, and during her explanation, we see a flashback of it happening. It's a tense scene, and maybe you could see a jump scare happening in the flashback itself, but then, out of nowhere, this demon appears right behind the father, making for the most unexpected scare you will ever see in a movie. Again, there was no signal at all that a demon would just suddenly appear right next to this family, especially when it's so bright and sunny in the setting like this. This is truly one of the greatest jump scares of all time in my opinion. But the 2010s does not stop there. As stated before, the fact that essentially everyone could make something now included opportunities for people that would never have had them before. We saw short films being uploaded to YouTube, and while of course many weren't good, there were some true gems along the way, and none of them shined more than Lights Out. This short film was so good that it actually got an entire feature film made about it, which I highly recommend as it is truly fantastic and has some of the best jump scares of the decade belonging to it. But we're actually going to just talk about the short film this time. The gimmick behind it is the fact that the demon in it only appears while in the dark. A woman here is heading to bed and turns the lights off when she sees an entity. But when she turns it back on, it is no longer in sight. She begins slowly flickering the lights and the tension is almost unbearable. You know this entity is going to do something at some point, but you don't know when. And somehow, even though I've seen it before, the point in which it appears right next to the door frame still gets me. But that's actually not even the only jump scare in the film. And the following one, which is less infamous, might even be more effective. This opening scare establishes the fact that this entity can only appear in the dark. With that in mind, you are naturally horrified by the dark, and so you don't want that to happen. The main character tapes the hallway lights on so it can stay on, but tension arises like crazy when the lamp starts flickering and the hallway light still shuts off. We hear noises and see the sheer horror of the main character's face, but after this entire struggle, she gets the lamp plugged in all the way. She's safe, right? The entity appears with the lights on. This completely breaks the rules and results in an incredible scare. And for the final jump scare we have here for the 2010s, we want to give a shout out to the movie It Follows for this incredible scene. Basically, we have a typical case of a woman being terrified by a demon that no one else believes in. So of course, she looks insane to her friends. At one point, her mother knocks on her door, but the character here is convinced that this is not her mother, but a demon instead. To really no one's surprise, the door was finally opened, and what do you know? It was her mother. However, what nobody expected was for a demon to actually appear behind the mother. This is horrifying on its own, but what makes it so effective is the look of the demon. For it, they actually got 7'7" Mike Lanier to be the demon, and his presence is just terrifying. This demon completely commands the frame, and his size is haunting. The music isn't actually that loud when he appears, but the insanely unexpected nature of this still counts it as one in my book. With all this out of the way, that about wraps up the history of jump scares in horror. But what about jump scares in non-horror movies? The goal of the jump scare is to surprise you. And what's more surprising than a jump scare in a movie that isn't even supposed to scare you? Because of this, these jump scares can even be more effective than ones in horror movies, because at least there you kind of figure you'll get at least one. But enough talk. Let's take a look at a few of the best jump scares ever from non-horror movies. We're going to start with Pee-wee's Big Adventure. That's right, this innocent movie has a horrifying jump scare. I'm sure if any of you have seen this one, you'll never forget it, especially since a lot of people saw it at a young age. But this one really is amazing. Pee-wee gets a drive from an old lady named Large Marge, and the atmosphere goes from the usual innocent to creepy, as she begins explaining a horror story. And then, as the story gets more intense, this happens.
It looked like this!
This may not look too terrifying without context, but keep in mind, this was watched by many kids at the time, and with the extremely lighthearted atmosphere of this movie, this came absolutely out of nowhere, and has forever been etched into the minds of kids everywhere. But by far the best jump scare ever in a non-horror movie is one that I'm sure you all thought about instantly when even hearing that we would cover some of these. And that is, of course, the Bilbo scene in Lord of the Rings. In this scene, we see our main character with the ring hidden in his shirt. Bilbo, up to this point, has been an incredibly nice person, but the second he even sees a sliver of the ring, he just snaps. Not only does this scare the living hell out of you, but it's also a genius way of showing the sheer power that this relic has on people and the world around it. This is some genuinely terrifying stuff, and only foreshadows what else there is to come. And well, with all of that now being finished, that about wraps up jump scares in cinema, from the very start all the way up to now. But cinema isn't the only place jump scares exist. Some of the best jump scares you will ever see exist outside of movies, and are instead within the world of the internet, or better yet, video games. Online Phenomena was already somewhat taken care of earlier, as Lights Out, the short film, was actually uploaded to YouTube, but one of the most famous jump scares of all time actually took place on the web. And you all know what that is. That's right, the Scary Maze game. We're not going to spend too much time talking about this because there really isn't much to say, it's just a stupid little prank. But this stupid little prank was so famous, it genuinely increased the popularity of jump scares as a whole majority, so I wanted to mention it for that. Thank you, Scary Maze game. Anyways, outside of the internet, we of course have video games, which have given us some truly amazing jump scares over the years. When compiling up a few of the best from video game history, I wound up getting super curious and wondered what the very first video game jump scare was. And I found that it was significantly older than I ever could have expected. According to my research, the very first jump scare ever in a video game was from all the way back in 1984 in a game on the Atari 5200 called Rescue on Fractalus. In this game, you are in a ship, and at one point you can see an alien running at the ship, before it disappears from view. It's gone for a few seconds, where it then suddenly appears at the window and breaks a hole, and this is accompanied by a loud noise. For being the first ever jump scare in a game, it's actually pretty effective, and I can't even imagine how scary that would have been at the time. But now on to some of the best, and of course I have to mention Amnesia. Released in 2010, this game literally became famous for its jump scares, which were actually quite unique as they weren't triggers like in most other games. You had to run into them, by either hallucinating with the game's sanity meter, or more commonly, running into the monster that follows you throughout the game. But as far as popularity goes when it comes to video games and jump scares, there isn't even one that comes close to Five Nights at Freddy's. Think whatever you want about the game, but its influence on jump scares within the industry cannot be understated, and it was single-handedly responsible for introducing likely millions of kids about jump scares in the first place. While the jump scares did understandably get old, I'll still never forget the first time I got spooked out while playing it. And now, for real this time, that is going to wrap up our deep dive into the art of the jump scare. Again, we know this video was very different than the normal video, but we wanted to do something special for Halloween. With that being said, I hope you have a marvelous Halloween. Thank you guys so much for watching. Make sure to follow all of our social medias for updates and exclusive content, all linked in the description. Especially consider becoming a patron, as even $1 a month really helps and you guys get some really slick rewards. And of course, make sure to like this video, share this with your friends, and subscribe. As always, my name is Sep from Debunk, wishing you guys a very spooky Halloween. Thank you guys so much for watching. Bye.